Peace FM 104.3. Good to meet you.
Mamisha is in free NMC and the suggestion say some more powers, you know. Now there's the slight danger, and I'm sure say it be much or much for whom say ma regulator no a lot more powers are. There is a likelihood say they might spiral into you can say arinesa a bit free expression. And me know the opinions that have been expressed, you know, me know essence there is always that tendency and that temptation to want to stretch regulation to the point one year it might degenerate into censorship. And at that point it becomes like constitutional and a legal censorship. In the sense that it is backed by law. Entina ibimu say let's maintain the powers as they have them now, but insist on efficiency and effectiveness. NMC is an important institution, and Ubisamia, the current state of the law regulating the work of the NMC, no, me fise and shadanye bad sir, but of course there are genuine concerns. Efa kwanya amanfo bi edi yomo ejuma in the media. Enunti people are suggesting say yemhwe na yema NMC more power so they can bite more. Because in prempi no so bi ye bibi wo media no mo a na yesi yedini call NMC a. Usually the penal regime no and the penalty regime no enshadanye very strong. Until and it is because the penalty regime and the sanctions regime very strong no, and until you some of the occurrences in the media they tend to endanger free speech and even compromise and undermine your democracy, no. But I do not think say in our bid to cure some of the excesses in the media, no, we want to create a somewhat like a monster somewhat and a monster of a sort. In the guy say ye per se ye regulate kwanya man for and media for ediyo mojuma. There is a thin line between an empowered NMC and an overbearing NMC, and that line is so thin that we can easily you can say ye betimi across it line no ama say see NMC na ye see ye per se ye more powerful and so on no, would become a source of censorship. It would become a source of I can't say, and it could become a ibia that undermines free expression. Intermediate essay Sadrin Hubim. Nemum, in the meantime, let's insist more on efficiency, on effectiveness. Because NMC in Primpi, you know, it's like they are very, you know, they are not very proactive. That's the word I want to use. Omunye very proactive. And sometimes people do the kinds of things they do in the media. Says yeah, I see there is this trend that is growing in the media space. There are so many monologues, especially in the morning. Presenters they are now giving Ghanaians all kinds of monologues or jinahwa basabi, and it appears that is what is trendy. Or na ye man of fans, no your followers. And I think NMC can be more effective in trying to regulate the way these monologues are done. Nobody saying we are presenter, don't reduce your show to a monologue. Nobody saying that. But in doing so, no, make sure say you meet the requirements and the guidelines now NMC for to regulate the activities of journalists, you know. But what I haven't seen, and say the NMC, like I said, is not proactive. So when these things are happening, you hardly find the NMC saying, say, oh, we've monitored your program. We've seen, say, on this day at this time, you did A, B, C, D. Those things tend to breach the guidelines, no. Unless somebody feels offended by the actions of a certain journalist, now or the according or the complaint according NMC, then NMC becomes reactive. I don't think, sir, that is the best way to run an institution such as NMC. They need to be proactive. They need to be on top of their game. They must have a unit that monitors. I'm not saying they monitor all airwaves, all radio stations in Ghana, but at least there should be a mechanism that would allow you to monitor some activities. Senebeya,
but and also so NMC will say whatever commission be can say or regulating media content and stuff like that.
No, not content. Nobody's saying, like I said, these monologues that are being done, that's what they think they want to do. Nobody's saying the NMC should come and tell them, say, discuss A, B, C, D. This should be the nature of your program. Structure it in this way. But make sure say came in a way that offends the very guidelines now a guide media any practitioners, that's all I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm not saying content there you decide what to do. That's what they decide. Say okay, and say it appears that is what is trendy. The louder you shout, the more you are celebrated as a journalist, whatever that means. What you say? And if they think that is what is trendy, and nobody is saying. But won kike muno, menko can sembia ebe offendi the rules of the game. Because NMC our guidelines that guide the activities and the works of journalists and all other practitioners in the media space. And in America, they should monitor to make sure that people operate within the limits of the regulations and the guidelines. And I'm sure when they start being proactive, kind of as I said, they are not trying to regulate or determine content for media houses. No. But utiho obi amfa complaint and bedan wa omo ankaso kra mutimi tie hu ni say papa ni okay die or yatra, but they will not take any action until somebody feels offended na nipa na ba. Esana is like you are an armchair commission of a sort. As a mudia ni say munshada nye proactive, and I think for me our focus should be more on how do we get NMC to be efficient or to a lesser extent effective, even what has here.
Okay.
Senebeya, they can guide the media space. But there's a difficulty also with the proliferation of all kinds of social media outlets. There are different types of social media. Here. Mainstream. And NMC is by law limited to just mainstream media. Media, I would have thought the conversation should also hinge on how do we expand the scope of Omejumano to include other non-mainstream media, no. Enu nana can me feel say ye di hun komo ebeboa because unkrofo they refer to themselves as journalists and media practitioners, and they don't operate in the mainstream media. Omukra na omo dangerous no. Ne hianzo benya camera bi ana phone bi, oya camera bi ana phone bi edisi nenima. Nsema obeka no. But because the law restricts NMC to just mainstream media, because at the time the law was framed, na any social media. And the law is not made for for man. Or is it the law is not made for the law? The law is made for man and not man for the law. Until as your law should be a reflection of your circumstances. There are other types of media become mainstream media. No. How do we get our regulator to be up to date? What has here? So if there is a need for an amendment of the act setting up the commission, no, but not to increase the powers in a way that, in my view, might get them to degenerate into the arena of censorship. In which case, it becomes legal censorship, which is very dangerous. Because censorship now is backed by law. And media, giving them more powers to bite, I think we should be calling for more efficiency and effectiveness and expanding the scope and our coverage of omo ejuma no to include other than mainstream media. Enu na me fi say ye ebeboa. And one other important element we tend to ignore in this conversation is owners of media houses. I think that beyond the guidelines NMC for Ediabetujano, I say media houses ankasa internally they should develop omankasa omo internal guidelines. What say when a country goes to ratify a treaty, it is only effective and is only valid to the degree that oba ukroma and oma imwa you take it to parliament and locally you ratify it. Media me feel say near yebetimi aye as media owners, media house owners, and say we can take the guidelines as universal guidelines. Now you are drafty and we develop in-house guidelines. Journalists bia, presenter bia or obedi ni juma no or share internally generated guidelines inspired by NMC guidelines no, so that internally say obi kra efuma there should be some internal mechanism to deal with nipa no ansana NMC kra abim. Sana nkikemune atemdidie ni nnyoma na MC mfata coming from journalists no. I think say ebetimi etiso kakra, ebetimi atiso kakra. But if we don't have our own internal mechanisms, then say once it is about followership no. Nipa no or didi atem kra no onye followership I no an here media house no. Ratings are relevant, but responsibility is equally very important. You ought to be responsible in what you churn out. You ought to be responsible in what you say. You ought to be responsible in what you write. And even though media houses are fixated on ratings and how many followers you have because any attractive adverts, they should also be minded by the need to be responsible to the audience and to the Ghanaian people in general. And you develop these internal mechanisms with a stringent sanctions regime in our various media houses. Me jidi say ye nyina yebetimi aboa ama NMC juma no ayi akoyi and they wouldn't need extra powers to bite because internally you have some checks mwankasa mudi atoho based on guidelines now omudi abeto no nti say metimi aja ehona mako asin north there.
Peace FM 104.3 good to meet